Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you tales of resilience, courage, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit. Today's story takes us to the heart of a city where a single child's determination sparked a movement that changed countless lives. It's a journey of heartbreak and hope, of people standing together against unimaginable odds to fight for justice and a better future. Join us as we uncover the hidden truths, the acts of bravery, and the unwavering love that turned tragedy into triumph. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories and begin today's journey with us. When I first met Abby, it was one of those Chicago nights where the cold gnaws at your bones, and the wind whispers reminders of things you'd rather forget. It was January, the kind of winter that makes even the sturdiest among us retreat indoors. I had been patrolling Lincoln Park, not because I was supposed to, but because I couldn't stay away. There were rumors, strange ones, about a little girl who had been seen sleeping on a bench. Some said she was a ghost, a figment of the collective imagination conjured by frost-bitten minds. But I had a feeling this was no legend. The park was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of brittle leaves scraping against the ground. As I moved deeper into the shadows, my flashlight caught something, just a flicker, near one of the old wooden benches. That's when I saw her. She was so small, curled up with a thin blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. A plastic bag, worn and crumpled, rested by her side like a makeshift treasure chest. Her hair, dark and unkempt, framed a face that was far too peaceful for the circumstances. The sight of her, so vulnerable under the indifferent Chicago sky, stopped me in my tracks. I knelt down a few feet away, careful not to startle her. "Hey there," I said softly, my breath forming clouds in the icy air. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. They were large and brown, brimming with something I couldn't quite place, something far older than a child her age should have carried. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm Jack," I replied, keeping my voice gentle. "I'm a police officer. Are you okay?" She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket closer. "I'm fine," she said, though her trembling hands betrayed her words. "Where are your parents?" "Sweetheart?" I asked. She hesitated, her gaze darting to the plastic bag beside her. "They're not here anymore," she said. I didn't press further, sensing that the answers I sought weren't ones she was ready to give. Instead, I offered her my hand. "Let's get you somewhere warm." "Okay. We'll figure everything else out later." She shook her head, pulling away slightly. "I can't," she said, her voice resolute despite its smallness. "I have to stay here." "Why?" I asked, genuinely baffled. She didn't answer, but her grip on the bag tightened. It was clear to me that whatever she was holding on to, it was more than just objects. It was her connection to something or someone she had lost. That night, I couldn't get her out of my mind. I returned to the precinct with a heaviness I hadn't felt in years. The officers there had heard the rumors too, and when I told them about Abby, most shrugged it off. "Probably just a runaway," one of them said dismissively. "Happens all the time." But this wasn't just any runaway. There was something about her that clung to me, like the lingering scent of smoke after a fire. I couldn't let it go. The next day, I confided in my colleague, Maya Hernandez. Maya was newer to the force, younger, with a sharp mind and a compassionate heart. If anyone would understand, it was her. "You saw her?" Maya asked, her eyes wide. I nodded. "She's just a kid." "Maya, alone out there in this cold. It doesn't sit right with me." Maya leaned back in her chair, her brows furrowed in thought. "What did she say? About her parents?" "She said they're not here anymore," I replied. "But there's more to it. She didn't want to leave the park. It's like she's waiting for something." Maya's expression softened. "It sounds like she's been through a lot. But if she's staying out there, she's in real danger. We have to do something." We decided to head back to Lincoln Park that evening, hoping to find her again. This time, Maya came with me, her presence a reassuring counterbalance to my growing frustration. As the sun dipped below the skyline, the park transformed into a labyrinth of shadows. We combed the area, calling out softly for Abby, but there was no sign of her. I began to wonder if she had moved on, or worse, if something had happened to her. Then, just as we were about to give up, Maya spotted a familiar shape near the same bench. It was Abby, sitting upright this time, her eyes scanning the park like a sentry. "Abby," I called out, relief flooding my voice. She turned, recognition flickering across her face. "You came back," she said simply. "Of course," I replied. "We're worried about you." Maya stepped forward, crouching to meet Abby's gaze. "Hi, Abby. I'm Maya. Can we talk for a little while?" Abby looked between us, her small frame tensing as if preparing to bolt. But something in Maya's demeanor seemed to put her at ease. For the next hour, we sat with her on that bench, coaxing fragments of her story from behind the walls she had built. She spoke in halting sentences, her words laced with pain and resilience. Her parents, she said, had been gone for over a year. She didn't explain how, only that she had been managing on her own. It wasn't just survival, it was something more deliberate. Abby knew the park's rhythms, its safe corners and blind spots. She moved with a precision that belied her age, evading attention like a shadow. It was clear she had learned these skills from someone or something beyond mere instinct. When we tried to press further, she clammed up, her small hands clutching the bag protectively. "I can't tell you," she whispered. "They'll find me." "Who?" Maya asked gently, but Abby shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't," she repeated. That night, as Maya and I walked back to the squad car, an unspoken understanding hung between us. This wasn't just a lost child. Abby was part of something much bigger, something that had left scars far deeper than the cold. The question now wasn't just how to help her, it was how to uncover the truth without pushing her further into the shadows. As I glanced back at the bench where we had found her, I couldn't shake the feeling that Abby was more than a victim. She was a key, a fragile, precious key to something we didn't yet understand. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that we couldn't afford to fail her. I didn't sleep that night. Abby's words played on a loop in my head. "They'll find me." The way her small frame had trembled, the fear that clouded her every movement, it wasn't something you could shake off. This wasn't a case of a runaway or a neglected child. This was deeper, darker, and I couldn't ignore it. The next morning, I found myself in Maya's office, coffee in hand and a plan forming in my mind. "She's hiding from someone," I said, skipping pleasantries. Maya looked up from her desk, her eyes red-rimmed from what I guessed was her own sleepless night. "I was thinking the same thing," she replied. "She's terrified. Jack. Whatever she's been through, it's not just about surviving on the streets. She's running from something." We decided to dig deeper. Abby hadn't given us much, but we knew where she was staying and what she looked like. That was enough to start. Maya and I began combing through missing persons reports. The sheer volume was staggering, hundreds of children reported missing in Chicago in the past year alone. As we scrolled through page after page of faces, I felt a growing sense of anger. How many of these kids had slipped through the cracks? How many had been failed by the very systems meant to protect them? After hours of searching, we came up empty. Abby's name wasn't in any of the reports. It was as though she didn't exist. "She's not in the system," Maya said, leaning back in her chair. "That doesn't make sense," I replied, rubbing the bridge of my nose. "A kid doesn't just vanish into thin air. Someone had to have noticed she was missing." Maya drummed her fingers on the desk, her brow furrowed. What if she was never reported missing? What if whoever she's running from didn't want anyone looking for her? The thought sent a chill down my spine. If Abby had been deliberately erased, It meant whoever was behind it had power to manipulate records, to make a child invisible. We decided to go back to Lincoln Park that evening. Abby's reluctance to leave made me think she'd still be there. Maybe we could gain her trust enough to learn more. When we arrived, the park was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, the night air biting at our skin. We found Abby near the same bench, sitting cross-legged with her plastic bag beside her. She didn't seem surprised to see us. "You came back," she said, her voice barely audible. "Of course," I replied, kneeling beside her. "We told you we'd help." Abby looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "You can't help," she said quietly. "Nobody can." Maya crouched beside me, her tone gentle but firm. "Abby, we're not going to let anything happen to you. But we need to understand what's going on. Can you tell us who you're afraid of?" Abby hesitated, her gaze darting around the park as though she expected someone to emerge from the shadows. Finally, she spoke. They take kids," she said, her voice trembling. "They say it's for a better life. But it's not. They hurt them. They make them disappear." Maya and I exchanged a look, the gravity of her words sinking in. "Who are they?" I asked gently. Abby shook her head, clutching her bag tightly. "I can't say. If they find me, they'll make me go back." Her words confirmed what we'd feared. Abby wasn't just a runaway, she was escaping something far worse. As we walked back to the car that night, Maya's expression was grim. "This isn't just a missing child case," she said. "This is trafficking." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd heard of trafficking rings operating in the shadows, exploiting the vulnerable and the unseen. But to hear it from a child's lips, to see the fear in her eyes, it made it all too real. The next day, we brought our suspicions to our captain, hoping to rally support. But the reaction we received was far from what we expected. "Trafficking?" Captain Ellis said, raising an eyebrow. "That's a serious accusation. Carter, do you have any evidence to back it up?" "She's evidence," Maya interjected. "A 3-year-old sleeping in the park, terrified of being found, that's not normal. And you know it." Ellis sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I get it. But without hard evidence, I can't authorize an investigation. Focus on finding her family first. If there's something bigger going on, we'll address it later." His dismissal felt like a slap in the face. "By the time we have evidence, it might be too late," I argued. Ellis gave me a pointed look. "And if you're wrong? If this is just a kid with a tragic story, but nothing more? Think about what you're accusing people of." Carter, frustrated but undeterred. Maya and I decided to take matters into our own hands. If the department wasn't going to back us, we'd find the evidence ourselves. We started by observing Abby from a distance, noting her routines and the people she interacted with. What we found only deepened the mystery. Abby was careful, too careful for a child her age. She avoided well-lit areas, moved through the park like she knew it better than most adults. And she never stayed in one place for too long. One evening, we saw her speaking to an older man near the park's edge. He handed her something, a folded piece of paper, before disappearing into the night. When we approached Abby, she tucked the paper into her bag, her expression guarded. "What was that?" I asked. "Nothing," she replied, her voice tight. "Abby, please," Maya said. "We just want to help." Reluctantly, Abby pulled out the paper and handed it to us. It was a map of the park, marked with routes and symbols we didn't understand. "What is this?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. "It's how I stay safe," Abby said simply. As Maya and I studied the map, a chilling realization dawned on us. This wasn't just a map of hiding spots. It was a blueprint for survival, a guide to navigating the park while avoiding detection. "Someone taught her this," Maya said, her voice low. "Someone who knew what they were doing." That night, As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only scratching the surface of something much larger. Abby wasn't just a child caught in a bad situation. She was a thread in a web of secrets, a web we were now tangled in. And I couldn't help but wonder how many others were out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice. The next few days passed in a blur of late-night stakeouts, whispered conversations, and pieced together fragments of Abby's guarded world. Every time we got close to understanding her, she retreated, like a skittish bird wary of the nets closing in. It was frustrating, but I couldn't blame her. Trusting people, after everything she'd endured, probably felt like handing over the last shreds of her armor. One evening, Maya and I decided to try a different approach. Instead of pressing Abby for answers, we brought her a meal from a nearby diner, nothing fancy. Just a warm burger and fries. It was a bitterly cold night, and we found her in her usual spot at Lincoln Park, huddled under the same thin blanket. "You must be hungry," I said, setting the bag down gently beside her. "We brought you something." She glanced at the bag warily, then at us, as if trying to gauge our motives. Slowly, she reached for the food, unwrapping the burger with small, deliberate movements. Maya and I sat on the bench beside her, giving her space to eat in silence. For a few minutes, the three of us shared the cold night air, the quiet punctuated only by the rustling of paper and the occasional crunch of fries. It was Maya who finally broke the silence. "You know, Abby," she said softly, "when I was little, I used to hide, too." Abby looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why?" Maya hesitated, then pulled up her sleeve to reveal a small scar on her forearm. "Because I was scared. My parents, they weren't there for me. I didn't know who to trust." Abby studied the scar for a moment, then returned her gaze to Maya's face. "What happened?" "I met someone who helped me," Maya replied, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "They didn't push me to talk. They just stayed. Let me figure out things in my own time." Abby didn't say anything, but her grip on the burger loosened slightly. It was the smallest of gestures, but to Maya and me, it felt like a breakthrough. That night, as we prepared to leave, Abby surprised us. She reached into her plastic bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Maya without a word. Maya unfolded it carefully, revealing what looked like a list of names, some crossed out, others circled, all written in a child's shaky handwriting. "What is this?" Maya asked gently. Abby hesitated, her small frame trembling. "They're the kids," she whispered. "The ones they took." Maya and I exchanged a glance, the weight of Abby's words settling heavily on our shoulders. This wasn't just a survival guide or a map of escape routes. It was a ledger, a record of something far darker than we had anticipated. Over the next few days, Maya and I began cross-referencing the names on Abby's list with missing persons reports. Some matched, while others didn't appear in any database. The more we dug, the clearer it became. Abby's list wasn't just random. It was a snapshot of a system that thrived on erasure, a network that targeted children who wouldn't be missed, whose disappearances could be swept under the rug. But how had Abby come into possession of this list? And more importantly, who had taught her how to navigate this shadowy world with such precision? The answer came sooner than we expected. One night, while watching Abby from a distance, we noticed a figure approaching her, a woman, her face partially obscured by a scarf. Abby didn't flinch or run. Instead, she greeted the woman with a familiarity that told us this wasn't their first meeting. Maya and I stayed hidden, observing as the woman handed Abby something, a bundle wrapped in cloth. Abby clutched it tightly, her expression a mix of gratitude and apprehension. As the woman turned to leave, we stepped out of the shadows. "Excuse me," Maya called, her tone firm but not threatening. "Can we talk to you?" The woman froze, her body tensing as she turned to face us. Her eyes darted between us and Abby, calculating her next move. For a moment, I thought she might run, but then she sighed, her shoulders slumping in resignation. "You're cops," she said, her voice low and steady. "Yes," I replied. "We're trying to help Abby. We need to understand what's going on." The woman hesitated, then gestured for us to follow her. She led us to a nearby alley, where the glow of a single street lamp cast long shadows on the brick walls. Once we were out of earshot of the park, she spoke. "My name is Julia," she said. "And if you're serious about helping Abby, you're going to need to understand what you're up against." Her words came like a flood, each one heavier than the last. Julia told us about a network hidden in plain sight that exploited the most vulnerable children, using them as pawns in a game of power and profit. She had once been part of this system, forced into it as a child after being separated from her own family. But instead of succumbing, she had found a way to fight back, creating a shadow network of her own. "We take the kids they forget," Julia said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "The ones they think no one will notice. We teach them how to survive, how to stay invisible." "And Abby?" Maya asked. Julia's gaze softened as she glanced back toward the park. "She's special," she said. "Her parents were different. They tried to expose the system. They paid the price for it." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Abby wasn't just another child lost in the cracks. She was the daughter of whistleblowers, the inheritor of a mission that had cost her family everything. "She has the list," Julia continued. "The names of the kids they've taken. If they find her, they'll do everything they can to silence her, just like they silenced her parents." As Julia's words sank in, I felt the enormity of what we were facing. This wasn't just about Abby anymore. It was about an entire system, a machine that thrived on secrecy and fear. And somehow, we had to stop it. But as I looked at Julia, her face illuminated by the dim streetlight, I saw something else: hope. Despite everything she had endured, she had found a way to fight back. And now, so would we. The next morning, Maya and I met at the precinct, our conversation with Julia still fresh in our minds. Everything she had told us pointed to a system so corrupt, so deeply embedded, that dismantling it felt like trying to uproot a forest with our bare hands. But there was no turning back now. Abby's safety and the truth about what had happened to her family depended on us. "Do you believe her?" Maya asked as we sifted through stacks of old case files. I nodded, though the weight of it made my chest tighten. She knew too much to be lying. And Abby trusts her. That has to mean something. We had no official support, no resources beyond our own determination. But Julia's story gave us a direction. Abby's parents, David and Sarah Wilson, weren't just attorneys, they were child rights advocates who had spent years investigating the same system that Julia had escaped. Their deaths, Julia had revealed, weren't accidental. They were assassinated. Their home set ablaze to silence them and destroy the evidence they'd uncovered. But one piece of evidence had survived: Abby. She doesn't just know the names, Julia had said. She remembers everything. Places, faces, routines. She's been taught to survive. But she's also been trained to watch, to record. Her parents prepared her for this, even if they didn't mean to. The thought of Abby carrying that burden at her age made my stomach churn. No child should have to live like that, constantly looking over her shoulder. Every interaction weighed against the possibility of betrayal. "Her bag," Maya said suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. "She's always so protective of it. What if there's more in there than just a blanket and some papers?" It was a good question, one I hadn't considered in the chaos of everything else. We decided to ask Abby directly that evening, approaching her with the same care we had learned to use over the past few days. When we arrived at the park, she was in her usual spot, the plastic bag clutched tightly against her chest. She looked up as we approached, her eyes wary but not frightened. "Hi, Abby," Maya said, crouching down to her level. "Can we talk for a minute?" Abby nodded silently, her grip on the bag tightening. I was wondering about your bag. Maya continued gently. You always keep it so close. Is there something special in there? Abby hesitated, her gaze darting between us. Finally, she unzipped the bag and pulled out its contents, a thin, tattered notebook, a handful of photographs, and a small USB drive. These are my parents' things, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Maya and I exchanged a glance before I spoke. What's on the drive? Abby. She shrugged. I don't know. My dad said it was important. He told me to keep it safe. The notebook, too, was filled with notes and diagrams, some of them too complex for us to decipher on the spot. But one thing was clear, David and Sarah had been onto something big. They had been tracking a network of officials, judges, social workers, law enforcement who were using their positions to traffic children through the foster care system. We need to look at this, Maya said, her tone urgent but calm. Abby, would it be okay if we borrowed the drive for a little while? Just to see what's on it? Abby's brow furrowed as she considered the request. Finally, she nodded. But you have to bring it back, she said firmly. It's all I have left of them. We promise, I said, my voice heavy with the weight of that promise. That night, Maya and I sat in her apartment, the USB drive plugged into her laptop. What we found left us speechless. The drive contained a trove of evidence, financial records, emails, surveillance footage. It wasn't just a trail of breadcrumbs, it was a map, a detailed account of how the trafficking network operated, from the initial placement of children in foster homes to their eventual disappearance. One folder, labeled urgent, contained footage that made my blood run cold. It showed Abby's parents meeting with a woman I recognized immediately, Julia. They were working together, Maya said, her voice tinged with awe. Julia must have been their informant. She's been fighting this from the inside all along. But there was more. The footage also showed a meeting between David Wilson and a man whose face was partially obscured. His voice, however, was clear. If you keep digging, the man said, there will be consequences. You have a family, Mr. Wilson. Think about them. David's reply was calm but resolute. I'm not afraid of you. The truth will come out, whether it's through me or someone else. The timestamp on the video was dated 2 days before the fire that had claimed David and Sarah's lives. They were murdered, Maya said, her hands trembling as she closed the laptop. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The enormity of what we were dealing with felt suffocating. Abby's parents had uncovered something so dangerous that it had cost them their lives. And now, Abby was the only one who could carry on their work. The next day, we met with Julia in a small cafe on the edge of the city. We showed her the footage, watching her expression shift from sorrow to anger as she processed what we had found. They knew, Julia said finally, her voice thick with emotion. They knew the risks. But they couldn't stop. They couldn't just turn away. Neither can we, I said, meeting her gaze. Julia nodded, her jaw set with determination. Then we do this together. But you need to understand something. The people behind this, they don't just sit back and wait. If they know we're coming, they'll strike first. As I looked at Julia, I saw a woman who had spent her entire life fighting a battle most people didn't even know existed. And as I thought about Abby, her small form huddled under that blanket, I knew we couldn't let her down. This wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about protecting the innocent. About standing up to a system that thrived on silence and fear. And it was about making sure that Abby's story didn't end the same way her parents had. With every passing hour, the weight of what we had uncovered pressed heavier on our shoulders. The evidence on the USB drive wasn't just damning, it was dangerous. Names, dates, financial transactions, it was all there. Enough to dismantle the trafficking network and expose the people behind it. But it was also enough to put a target on anyone who dared to reveal it. Julia had been right. The The system wouldn't go down without a fight. That morning, we met in a safe house Julia had arranged. The room was bare except for a folding table and mismatched chairs. Abby sat at the corner of the table, clutching her blanket, her wide eyes darting between us as we strategized. "We can't take this to the precinct," Maya said. "Captain Ellis would shut it down before it even started." "Then we go higher," Julia suggested. "Federal agencies. Someone outside the local chain of command." "Even that's risky," I said, pacing the room. "If this network is as big as it seems, we can't trust that the feds are clean either." Julia nodded grimly. "That's why we need a plan that doesn't rely on them." The idea began to take shape. We would release the evidence publicly, in a way that couldn't be ignored or buried. Julia's network of contacts, other survivors and allies she had built relationships with over the years, would help. Social media, independent journalists, encrypted forums. Our goal was to make sure the truth reached as many people as possible. But there was a problem. The people behind this network were powerful, and they had eyes everywhere. We needed time to prepare the release, and we needed to keep Abby safe until then. "We'll have to move her," Julia said, her voice firm. "The park isn't secure anymore. If they realize how close we are, they'll come for her." Abby's head snapped up at that, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. "I don't want to go," she said, her voice trembling. "What if you can't find me again?" Maya knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll always find you, Abby. But we need to keep you safe. Do you trust us?" Abby hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Okay." Julia arranged for Abby to be taken to one of her safe houses on the outskirts of the city. The place was nondescript, hidden in plain sight, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. We dropped Abby off late that night, her small frame disappearing behind the front door as Julia led her inside. "She'll be okay," Maya said as we drove away, though her voice wavered slightly. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "She has to be." Over the next few days, Maya and I worked tirelessly to piece together the rest of the puzzle. The more we uncovered, the more horrifying the scope of the operation became. Judges, social workers, law enforcement officers, they were all complicit, using their positions to funnel children into the hands of traffickers. And it wasn't just limited to Chicago. The network spanned cities, states, even countries. It was a machine, fueled by greed and indifference. And its victims were the most vulnerable among us. One night, as Maya and I pored over financial records in her apartment, the tension boiled over. "This is impossible," she said, slamming a folder onto the table. "Every time we think we've got a handle on it, there's another layer, another name. How do we fight something this big?" "We fight it piece by piece," I said, though I felt the weight of her frustration too. "We don't have to dismantle the whole system overnight. We just need to start." Maya sighed, rubbing her temples. "And what happens if they find out? If they come after Abby? Or Julia? Or us?" The question hung in the air, unspoken but understood. We were putting everything on the line, our careers, our reputations, our lives. "They've already taken so much from Abby," I said quietly. "If we don't do this, they win. And more kids will end up just like her, or worse." Maya looked at me, her eyes softening. "You're right," she said. "But we need to be smart about this. No more risks than we have to take." The next morning, we received our first warning. When I arrived at the precinct, I found an anonymous note tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." I showed it to Maya, who frowned deeply. "They know," she said. "We need to move faster." But moving faster wasn't an option. Releasing the evidence required careful planning. If we rushed it, we risked exposing Abby and Julia without the protection of public scrutiny. That evening, Julia called with more troubling news. One of her contacts, a journalist who had agreed to help disseminate the evidence, had been attacked. They were alive, but shaken and unwilling to continue. They're trying to scare us into silence, Julia said. Are you scared? I asked. Her voice hardened. Not enough to stop. But the truth was, we were scared. Every step forward felt like walking a tightrope, the abyss yawning below us. And yet, despite the fear, there was something else, a flicker of hope. Because for the first time, the people behind this network were losing control. They were scrambling, reacting instead of orchestrating. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the night wore on, I found myself thinking about Abby, her small figure huddled under that blanket in the park. She had survived so much more than any child should ever have to endure. And yet, she hadn't given up. If she could hold on to hope, so could we. This ends with them, I said to Maya as we prepared for another long night of planning. Not with us. She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her exhaustion. For Abby. For Abby. I echoed. And so, we kept going, step by careful step, toward the fight we knew we couldn't afford to lose. The morning after the anonymous warning, Maya and I received a chilling call from Julia. Her voice was tight with urgency, the kind of fear that comes from years of knowing exactly how dangerous the world can be. They're moving, she said. Abby's safe house isn't secure anymore. We need to get her out tonight. I didn't ask how Julia knew, I trusted her instincts. If she said Abby was in danger, then she was. Maya and I grabbed our things and headed straight to the location. A nondescript house tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. When we arrived, Julia was waiting for us, her eyes darting nervously down the street. I've got a van parked around back, she said. It's unmarked. But we need to be quick. If they've found us, they won't give us much time. Inside, Abby sat cross-legged on the floor, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up as we entered, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. Are we leaving again? She asked softly. I crouched down beside her, keeping my voice calm. Just for a little while. We're going somewhere safer. Okay. She nodded, clutching her blanket tighter. Okay. As we packed up Abby's things, Julia explained the new plan. The network had another safe house farther out, deep in the countryside. It wasn't ideal, but it was remote, hard to track, and staffed by people Julia trusted completely. They won't find her there, Julia said. At least, not right away. The drive was tense. Maya drove, her eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. Julia sat beside her, scanning the surroundings for anything out of the ordinary. Abby and I were in the back, the silence punctuated only by the hum of the engine. About halfway through the journey, Abby tugged at my sleeve. Will I ever stop running? She asked, her voice barely audible. Her question hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't have an answer, at least. Not one that would make sense to a child who had spent her entire life looking over her shoulder. So I told her the only thing I could. One day, I said. One day, you'll be able to stay in one place. And no one will make you run again. She stared at me for a moment, her small face solemn. Promise? I swallowed hard. I promise. We arrived at the safe house just as the sun was setting. The place was a small farmhouse surrounded by fields. The kind of place that felt disconnected from the rest of the world. A man and a woman, both in their late 40s, greeted us at the door. They introduced themselves as Paul and Linda, members of Julia's network who had been running the safe house for years. Abby will be safe here, Linda said, her voice warm but firm. We'll make sure of it. Abby hesitated as we led her inside, her small hand gripping mine tightly. But as Linda knelt down to speak to her, something in Abby's posture softened. Maybe it was Linda's kind eyes, or the way she spoke to Abby like she was an adult rather than a fragile child. Whatever it was, Abby seemed to relax, at least a little. As we prepared to leave, Abby clung to my arm. You're coming back, right? I nodded. Of course. We just need to take care of a few things first. But Linda and Paul will look after you until then. Her eyes searched mine, looking for reassurance. Okay. The drive back was quieter, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Julia was the first to break the silence. They'll know we've moved her, she said. We have to assume they're watching all of us now. I wouldn't be surprised. Maya said. They've already shown they're willing to go after anyone who gets in their way. We reached the city just after midnight. Tired but resolute. The next step was clear: we had to release the evidence. But it wasn't as simple as hitting a button and watching the truth spread. We needed to coordinate with Julia's contacts. Ensure the information reached the right people at the right time. That night, Julia gathered us at one of her safe houses in the city, a small, nondescript office space with a few computers and stacks of files. It was here that we finalized the plan. The evidence would be distributed through multiple channels simultaneously: independent journalists, advocacy groups, and encrypted forums where it could be shared widely. We're not just exposing them, Julia said. We're forcing them to react. If we make this public enough, fast enough, they won't have time to cover it up. Maya nodded, her jaw set with determination. And what happens to us when they figure out where it came from? Julia's expression was grim. We've already crossed that line. They'll come after us no matter what we do. As we worked, I couldn't stop thinking about Abby. She was just a child. Yet she carried the weight of an entire operation on her small shoulders. Her parents had entrusted her with their legacy, their mission. And she had borne it without complaint. But it wasn't fair. It never should have been her burden to carry. As dawn broke over the city, we finished the last of our preparations. The evidence was ready, the plan in place. All that was left was to wait for the right moment. You should get some rest, Julia said, placing a hand on my shoulder. It's going to be a long day. I nodded. Though I knew sleep wouldn't come easily, the fight was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. But for Abby, for every child who had been failed by the system, we couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Not ever. The morning of the release felt surreal. The city was waking up as if it were any other day, oblivious to the storm about to break. Maya and I sat in Julia's safe house, surrounded by screens displaying encrypted messages from her network. Contacts were standing by in cities across the country, ready to amplify the evidence as soon as it went live. Everything's set, Julia said, her voice steady but her hands betraying her nerves as they tapped rhythmically on the desk. Once we hit send, there's no going back. Maya nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. We're ready. I wasn't sure we were, but there was no turning back now. The evidence we had prepared was overwhelming. Financial records tracing the flow of money through shell companies, emails detailing bribes and cover-ups, video footage of officials making deals in the shadows. It was the culmination of years of work, not just hours. But Abby's parents and Julia's entire network. At precisely 9 a.m., Julia pressed the button. A small beep signaled the start of something we couldn't undo. The files began uploading to multiple platforms simultaneously, each one programmed to bypass traditional takedown methods. Within minutes, the evidence was live, spreading like wildfire through social media, independent news outlets, and encrypted forums. We watched in tense silence as the first reactions began to roll in. Journalists were already dissecting the documents, their tweets and articles confirming what we had known all along. This was bigger than anything the public had ever imagined. Hashtags began trending within the hour, and the footage of corrupt officials accepting bribes was shared millions of times. Then came the first backlash. News channels tied to the very people we were exposing began their counterattack, dismissing the evidence as fabricated and accusing Julia's network of being a dangerous fringe group. It was expected, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. They're trying to control the narrative, Maya said, her voice tight with frustration. But this time, we have the upper hand. The evidence is too widespread to contain. She was right. The story had already reached international outlets, and prominent figures in advocacy and law enforcement were publicly calling for investigations. For the first time, the network's leaders were on the defensive. Their names and faces plastered across headlines for all the wrong reasons. But our victory came at a cost. By midday, Julia's network reported an uptick in activity near the safe houses. Cars with tinted windows were spotted circling the areas where her contacts lived. One of the journalists who had helped distribute the evidence called to say their home had been broken into. Nothing was stolen. But the message was clear. They're trying to scare us, Julia said. Her jaw clenched. But they're too late. The story's already out. I wasn't so sure. The people we were dealing with weren't the kind to give up without a fight. And they had resources, money, influence, and the kind of reach that could make people disappear. As night fell, the city seemed to hold its breath. Julia's safe house was quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. Abby was safe, tucked away in the countryside. But that didn't stop the knot of worry in my chest from tightening. Around midnight, a new development hit. One of the encrypted forums Julia's network had been monitoring posted a series of leaked messages. The leaders of the trafficking network were scrambling, their emails filled with panicked directives and desperate attempts to contain the fallout. They're planning a meeting, Julia said, her eyes scanning the screen. Tomorrow night, at the Dominion Hotel. It's their last-ditch effort to regroup. We can't let that happen, Maya said. If they reorganize, they'll bury what's left of the evidence and come after everyone involved. Julia nodded. Agreed. But we can't just walk in there. They'll have security everywhere. What about the kids? I asked, my mind racing. The ones they've been using. They know the system better than anyone. Could they help us? Julia hesitated. It's risky. But if we pull it off. She didn't have to finish the thought. The kids Julia had protected, trained, even, were more than just survivors. They were a network of invisible agents who had spent years learning how to navigate the very system we were trying to dismantle. Within the hour, Julia was on the phone, coordinating with her contacts. The plan was ambitious, almost reckless. We would infiltrate the Dominion Hotel, gather any additional evidence the traffickers had kept hidden, and expose their attempts to regroup. But the most critical part of the plan wasn't about breaking in. It was about Abby. She's the key, Julia said. Her testimony, her connection to her parents' work, it's what ties everything together. Without her, the public might start to doubt the story. No, I said firmly. She's been through enough. We're not putting her in danger again. Julia's expression softened. I know. And that's why she'll stay where she is. But her story, it has to be told. If we don't, they'll twist it into something unrecognizable. Maya placed a hand on my shoulder. We'll find a way to protect her and make sure her voice is heard. That night, as I lay on the couch in Julia's safe house, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to Abby, her small figure curled up in her blanket, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She had carried so much already, more than any child should ever have to. But her courage had gotten us this far. As dawn broke, I made a promise to myself, no matter what happened, we would finish what Abby's parents started, and we would make sure she never had to run again. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. But for the first time, it felt like we had a chance. A real chance to bring the people behind this network to justice and to give Abby, and every child like her, the safety and freedom they deserved. The next evening, we found ourselves parked in a dark alley a block away from the Dominion Hotel. The neon glow of its name reflected on the wet pavement. A stark reminder of the opulence we were up against. Maya, Julia, and I huddled in the van, finalizing the details of our plan. This is it, Julia said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. They'll all be here, the architects of everything we've been fighting. If we pull this off, we can dismantle the network for good. Maya nodded, checking her phone for updates from Julia's network. The kids stationed around the hotel had already reported a steady stream of luxury cars pulling into the underground parking lot. They're here, Maya said. Judges, social workers, even the head of that fake charity. It's a who's who of corruption. My chest tightened. And security. Everywhere, Julia replied. But the kids have mapped out blind spots in the surveillance system. They'll guide us in. The plan was bold. Almost reckless. We would infiltrate the hotel and reach the private conference room where the traffickers were meeting. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was extraction. We needed to access their hidden servers, where we suspected the rest of the evidence, names, transactions, and records, was stored. It was a risky gamble. But the kids in Julia's network had proven invaluable. Over the years, they had learned to navigate the shadows, moving through the city undetected, observing everything. Tonight, they were our eyes and ears. At precisely 9 p.m., we made our move. Maya and I slipped into the hotel through a service entrance, following a route Julia's team had marked as safe. Dressed as hotel staff, we blended into the background, carrying trays and avoiding eye contact. Julia stayed in the van, monitoring the kids' live updates and feeding us instructions through earpieces. Take the stairs to your left, she said. The elevator's too risky, they've got cameras inside. We ascended the staircase quietly, each step bringing us closer to the conference room. My pulse pounded in my ears, the weight of what we were about to do pressing down on me. At the top floor, we paused behind a door marked authorized personnel only. Julia's voice crackled in my ear. There's a guard outside the room, she said. Wait for the signal. Seconds felt like hours as we stood there, holding our breath. Then, through the small crack under the door, I saw movement. A young boy, no older than 10, darted down the hallway, dropping a tray of drinks with a loud crash. The guard cursed and rushed to investigate, leaving the conference room unprotected. Go, Julia urged. We slipped into the room, shutting the door softly behind us. Inside, we found what we were looking for, a row of laptops and a small server rack humming quietly in the corner. Maya moved quickly, plugging a portable drive into one of the laptops. The device began downloading files, the screen filling with folders labeled with innocuous names that hid their true purpose. As we worked, voices echoed in the hallway outside. They're coming back, I whispered. Julia's voice was calm but urgent. You've got 2 minutes. Finish the transfer and get out. Maya's fingers flew over the keyboard, her expression tense. Almost there, she said. Just a little longer. I moved to the door, peering through the small glass window. The guard was returning, flanked by another man in a dark suit. We don't have time, I said. The download completed with a soft beep, and Maya pulled the drive from the laptop. Got it, she said, stuffing it into her pocket. We slipped out just as the guard reached the door, ducking into the stairwell and descending as fast as we could without making noise. Julia guided us back through the service corridors, the kids' updates keeping us one step ahead of security. By the time we reached the van, my hands were shaking. Julia drove us to another safe house on the edge of the city, where we plugged the drive into her secure system. The files were everything we had hoped for and more. Names, transaction records, meeting minutes. It wasn't just local officials. This network extended far beyond Chicago, spanning multiple cities and implicating people at every level of government. This is it, Maya said, her voice filled with equal parts awe and disbelief. This is everything we need. But as we celebrated the breakthrough, Julia's phone buzzed with an incoming message. Her face paled as she read it. They know. What? I asked. The guard must have seen us, Julia said. They know someone was in the room. They're locking down the hotel and mobilizing their people. We need to move, Maya said. Now. We packed up the equipment and prepared to leave. But before we could, Julia's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from one of her contacts at the safe house where Abby was staying. They've found her, Julia said, her voice breaking. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. My heart pounded as I processed her words. Abby wasn't just our responsibility, she was the key to everything. If they got to her, everything we had worked for would crumble. We have to go, I said, grabbing my jacket. We're not leaving her behind. Julia nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Then let's finish this. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But as we sped toward the countryside, I knew one thing for certain, we wouldn't let them take Abby. Not now. Not ever. The countryside was dark. The narrow road ahead illuminated only by the van's headlights. Julia drove with an urgency that made the tires hum against the asphalt. The air in the van was thick with tension. Our silence filled with unspoken fears. Abby was out there, vulnerable, and in the hands of people who would stop at nothing to silence her. We had come so far, uncovered so much, but none of it would matter if we lost her now. We're close, Julia said, her eyes scanning the road for any signs of movement. The safe house is just ahead. Maya leaned forward, gripping the dashboard. Do we have a plan? We don't know what we're walking into, Julia replied. But we go in together. And we get her out. That's the plan. The farmhouse came into view, its silhouette barely visible against the starless sky. The lights were off. The windows dark. Something was wrong. Linda and Paul, who ran the safe house, always kept a single porch light on as a signal to Julia's network. Tonight, there was only darkness. Julia slowed the van, pulling off the road and cutting the engine. We go on foot from here. Quietly. We climbed out, the cold night air biting against my skin. Julia handed us each a flashlight. But we kept them off for now, relying on the faint moonlight to guide us. As we approached the farmhouse, the silence was deafening. No movement. No sound, just the eerie stillness of an abandoned space. My chest tightened with each step. Stay close, Julia whispered, leading the way. We reached the porch, and Julia motioned for us to stop. She pressed her ear to the door, listening intently. After a moment, she turned to us, her expression grim. It's too quiet. Maya nodded, her hand already on the doorknob. She turned it slowly, the door creaking as it opened. The living room was empty, the furniture overturned. A table lay shattered on the floor, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. They were here, Julia said, her voice barely audible. But they left in a hurry. I stepped into the room, scanning for any sign of Abby. My heart sank as I noticed the broken frame of a picture she had drawn, a crude but sweet depiction of 3 stick figures holding hands. One of them was labeled me. They took her, I said, my voice shaking. Julia picked up the broken frame, her jaw tightening. Not without a fight. She pointed to scuff marks on the floor near the back door, signs of a struggle. But there was something else, tiny footprints leading out into the field behind the house. She ran, Maya said, following the prints. Abby ran. We bolted out the back door, our flashlights now cutting through the darkness. The footprints led toward the woods, where the trees formed a dense canopy that blocked out what little light the moon provided. Abby, I called, my voice echoing through the night. It's us. You're safe. For a moment, there was no response, only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But then, faintly, I heard it, a small, trembling voice calling back. Here. I'm here. We followed the sound, weaving through the trees until our flashlights illuminated a small figure huddled against a fallen log. Abby's face was streaked with tears, her blanket wrapped tightly around her. She looked up at us with wide, frightened eyes. I hid, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know where to go. I dropped to my knees beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. You did so good, Abby, I said, my voice breaking. You're so brave. Julia and Maya knelt beside us, checking her for injuries. Aside from a few scratches, she seemed unharmed. We need to move, Julia said, her tone urgent. If they're still nearby, they'll come back. Abby clung to me as we made our way back to the van. I could feel her small body trembling against mine, her fear palpable. Once we were safely inside, Julia started the engine, and we sped away from the farmhouse, leaving the darkened woods behind. As we drove, Abby began to speak, her words hesitant but determined. They were looking for me, she said. The man said, he said I knew too much. Maya turned in her seat, her eyes wide. What else did they say? Abby hesitated, then whispered. They're meeting tomorrow. The big man will be there, the one in the pictures. It took a moment for her words to sink in. The big man could only mean one thing, the leader of the entire network. The one person we had been unable to identify or locate until now. Julia's grip on the steering wheel tightened. If we take him down, the rest of the operation will collapse. But it's a trap, Maya said. They know we're onto them. They'll be expecting us. I looked at Abby, her small face illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. She had been through so much, and yet she still found the strength to help us. We don't have a choice, I said. We go. But this time, we end it. The van fell silent as we drove through the night, each of us lost in our thoughts. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, we had a real shot at bringing this operation to its knees. And we weren't going to waste it. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Julia's network was already in motion. Messages zipped across encrypted channels, and every ally was mobilized for what could be the most pivotal moment in this fight. Abby's revelation had given us a single, critical advantage, the meeting place of the network's elusive leader. This was the moment we had been working toward. But the stakes were higher than ever. Julia spread a map across the table in the safe house, marking the location Abby had described. It was an upscale event venue on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by sprawling gardens. Perfectly secluded. It was the kind of place designed for private meetings far from prying eyes. They've fortified it, Julia said, tapping the map. Surveillance cameras, security teams, and probably escape routes we don't know about. They'll be expecting us. Maya leaned against the wall, her arms crossed. We're walking into the lion's den. Exactly, Julia said. But that's where we need to be. If we take out their leader, the entire network will crumble. What about Abby? I asked. She was sitting in the corner, hugging her knees to her chest. She looked so small, so fragile. Yet there was a quiet strength in her eyes. She stays here, Julia said firmly. This isn't her fight anymore. She's done enough. Abby looked up, her voice soft but steady. But what if you don't come back? The room fell silent. None of us could promise her that we would. I knelt beside her, taking her small hands in mine. You've already done the hardest part, Abby. You've been so brave. Now it's our turn. We'll do everything we can to make sure you don't have to run anymore. She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. Okay. Julia began assigning roles. Maya and I would infiltrate the venue alongside two of Julia's most trusted operatives, while Julia stayed outside to coordinate. The kids in her network would monitor the perimeter, providing updates on security movements and escape routes. We'll be in and out, Julia said. No unnecessary risks. Get the leader, get the files, and get out. It sounded simple enough, but we all knew the truth. This was a high-risk mission. The people we were going up against were ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to use violence if cornered. As night fell, we approached the venue under the cover of darkness. dressed in black and armed with the tools we needed. We moved like shadows, following the directions fed to us through Julia's earpiece. "There's a gap in the security cameras on the east side," Julia said. "Head there now." Maya and I exchanged a glance before slipping through the garden. The air was cool and still, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath our feet. Every step felt like a gamble, every breath a reminder of how close we were to danger. We reached the building and entered through an unlocked service door. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The venue was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that only comes when something important and dangerous is happening. "The meeting room is on the second floor," Julia said. "You're looking for a man in a grey suit. He's their leader." As we ascended the staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My pulse quickened, but I pushed the fear aside. We had come too far to back down now. We reached the second floor and found the meeting room. Peering through the crack in the door, we saw a group of men seated around a long table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of a laptop screen. At the head of the table sat the man in the grey suit, his expression cold and calculating. "That's him," Julia confirmed through the earpiece. Maya pulled out a small device, a signal jammer designed to disable any communications in the room. She activated it, and the soft hum of interference filled the air. "Let's go," she said. We burst into the room, catching the men off guard. The leader stood abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he realized who we were. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said, his voice calm but threatening. "You're out of your depth." "Maybe," I replied, stepping forward. "But we've got everything we need to bring you down." Maya began downloading files from the laptop while I kept watch. The men at the table didn't move, but their silence was heavy with unspoken threats. "You won't get away with this," the leader said. "The system is bigger than you, bigger than all of us." "That's what they all say," Maya shot back, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Until it isn't." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Julia's voice came through the earpiece, her tone urgent. "They're coming. You need to get out now." Maya grabbed the portable drive and nodded to me. "Let's go." We backed out of the room, our hearts pounding as the footsteps grew louder. We sprinted down the hallway, descending the staircase just as security guards appeared at the top. "Out the way you came," Julia instructed. We bolted through the garden, the guards' shouts growing fainter as we reached the perimeter. The kids monitoring the area guided us to the escape route, their voices clear and calm despite the chaos. By the time we reached the van, my lungs were burning. But we had what we came for. The files on the drive were enough to dismantle the network for good. As Julia drove us back to the safe house, I looked out the window, the city lights blurring in the distance. We had won a critical battle, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Back at the safe house, Abby ran to me, throwing her arms around my waist. "You came back," she said, her voice filled with relief. I held her tightly, my heart heavy with both gratitude and determination. "I told you I would." This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt system. It was about giving Abby and every child like her a chance to live without fear. And we weren't going to stop until that chance was a reality. The mission was over. But the story was just beginning. The evidence we uncovered dismantled the network that had thrived in the shadows for far too long. Headlines around the world exposed the web of corruption, and arrests rippled through every level of power. Children who had once been invisible were now seen, their voices impossible to ignore. Abby, no longer the frightened girl hiding under a blanket, began to rebuild her life with Julia, Maya, and me by her side. The safe houses became legitimate centers of hope, and the system that once failed so many began its transformation. As I watched Abby play in the garden of her new home, her laughter ringing out in the warm afternoon light, I felt something I hadn't in years: hope. She had survived. And in doing so, she had inspired a movement that would change countless lives. This story isn't just about Abby, or Julia, or even me. It's about resilience, love, and the power of ordinary people to fight for what's right. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Life Stories for more powerful tales of courage and hope. Together, we can inspire change.